the new year means, as is our new tradition here on the podcast, it is time to go over my reading list. So, as longtime listeners know, my target is usually to read about 5 books per month. And we've started the habit of, at the beginning of each new month, reviewing the books I read during the past month. So now it is time to talk about the 5 books I read in December 2021. Are you ready for this, Jesse?
I'm ready. Let's go.
All right. So the first book I completed in that month was How Star Wars Conquered the Universe by Chris Taylor. This is basically a George Lucas biography that has some pop culture reporting on the Star Wars phenomenon. Now, you might remember this, Jesse. This was controversial. We talked about this back in December when I was reading it. I asked the listeners, is it okay that I am skipping the chapters that are about the cultural reception of Star Wars? So early on, the book started going back and forth. It would be a chapter from the timeline of George Lucas's career, so biography. And then it would switch to a chapter that would be about, here's a group of guys that dress up like stormtroopers and who they are and what's that like. And I was not so interested in the cultural stuff. I wanted the biography. This is part of my ongoing effort to my movie effort. I'm reading book after book about various people in the movie industry for some weird reason. And so I asked the audience if it was okay if I skipped that. And Jesse, you gave me the thumbs up on that, I believe, if I'm remembering.
Yeah, that was okay. That was okay.
Well, so here's the thing. I have more defense for my approach because he stopped, the author, Chris Taylor, stopped doing that switching before, I don't know, 2/3 of the way into the book. And so it became straight biography really for the end of it. So in the end, I probably only skipped, I don't know, 30% of the material. So I'm going to count that. So as I mentioned, this is part of my random project to really dive into the film industry. This is maybe the 4th or 5th book I've read in a row that is on that topic. I'm not sure why this is interesting so much, but it really has been this fall. And I really wanted to learn about George Lucas, having finished a biography of Steven Spielberg the month before. And a few things I learned. One, Lucas was a really good director. So in this scene, there's this scene centered around USC where there was Lucas and there was Coppola, and Spielberg wasn't at USC, but he was in their circle. Scorsese was in their circle, among some others. Brian De Palma was in their circle. So it's this big group of directors, and they all knew each other. In that circle, Lucas was considered a hotshot. So he had this great animated student short that won a bunch of awards and put him on the map. Like, wow, Lucas is the guy he's the auteur. He's the guy with the vision. And then he did the student version of THX, which also blew people away. So I think people didn't realize that about Lucas. Coppola really was trying to get Lucas to direct Apocalypse Now. But Lucas he decided to do Star Wars instead, basically. So he was considered like the artistic guy. So that's kind of interesting. The other thing I found out about Lucas is, like these other guys, timing is important. Him and Spielberg came up just as the movie industry was changing, just as they were leaving the studio system. So, Coppola's first movie was Finnegan's Rainbow, which was a classic studio soundstage movie. Then he did The Godfather. So it was like right as they were transitioning away from the studio system, and they invented this idea of the blockbuster, where you could have a movie that appeal to all these different age groups and could be in 3,000 theaters and make all this money. And so their timing was right. They were talented, and Lucas, even more so than Spielberg, had a relentless go big ambition. So if he was going to do a movie, just like a student movie, he was going to do THX student movie, he was going to find a way to get access to an abandoned military base and push the setting, push the technology. He was going to make a movie where you're going to say, wow, this is a lot bigger than I thought someone with that budget could do. And that was the approach that made Star Wars big. He was like, we're going to invent new technology for the special effects. It's going to be bigger than anyone's ever seen. Clearly, James Cameron picked up that torch from Lucas after the fact. So anyways, that's what I learned about Lucas, is this guy was incredibly talented, incredibly ambitious. He wanted to do everything bigger than anyone had ever done it before, and really, really focused. Also very rich. So I don't know if you know that, but
Yeah, he's like a billionaire, isn't he?
yeah, he's a billionaire. Were you a Star Wars guy, Jesse?
I've seen some of the movies, not all of them. Probably not as much as you are. Is Lucas and Spielberg friends?
Yeah, they were friends. They all knew each other, and they were going back and forth. It's hard to overestimate how much money they were making back then. They were going back and forth, trading off who had the number one movie of all times, and they were trading this back and forth, multiple times in less than a decade. And it's hard to overestimate just how phenomenally successful they were as filmmakers during the 1980s. I mean, it was, let's see, what was Well, E.T. blew it away. So Jaws was number one, and then Lucas got it back with Star Wars, and then Spielberg beat Star Wars with E.T., right? So like they were just going back and forth. Jurassic Park, I believe, was number one for a while in the all-time box office list, and it's just incredible how successful those two guys were. Spielberg directed Raiders of the Lost Ark for Lucas. So as Lucas produced it, it was his project, and he asked Spielberg to direct it. So they ran in the same circles. They knew each other pretty well. Both very rich. All right, enough about movies. Second book, In Praise of Slow, by Carl Honore. This is a book, I think this was from the early 2000s, about the rise of various slow movements. So starting with slow food in Italy in the 1980s, and then it moved from there, slow cities, slow parenting, slow work. I read it because it was background for a New Yorker piece. So there's a New Yorker piece. My most recent one came out on January 4th. And I was introducing this idea of slow productivity. And I read that book, Carl's book, as part of it. So I talk about it in the article. So that's why I read that. So long story short, there was a slow work movement that said we should work less hours. And basically my argument in that article is going to a 4-day work week, right? As has been proposed recently by Congressman Mark Takano. He is proposing a bill to make a 4-day work week the official federal standard here in the U.S. The Congressional Progressive Caucus has now endorsed it. That's 100 Congress people now endorsed it. And so I talk about that in the article, that there's this push to shorten the work week, and that when it comes to knowledge work, my argument is that's not going to solve the problem. That's not going to solve burnout. The problem that knowledge workers have is actually the volume of work that's on their plate. The number of things that's on their plate that they have to make progress on, commitment, tasks, projects that people have thrown at them. And that when that volume gets too large, it creates a feedback spiral that makes work incredibly stressful, and it burns people out. And so we don't need longer weekends. We actually need lower work volumes, which is going to require rethinking how we do work. And that was what I called slow productivity. So I introduced that concept, and Carl's book helped me with that. Interestingly, Mark Takano then tweeted about the article. It's what I've discovered, Jesse, writing for the New Yorker, is in a past life, if I would cite someone who was sort of well known or write about them, it was in my mind, it was, well, I'm just writing for this small audience, and they don't care. Now they care. Now they see it. I mean, the people I write about see these things, so I have to be a little more careful.
What's an example of a slow city?
I don't, it's all this stuff was very like late 90s, early 2000s. So there's some slow cities in Italy, less cars, more walkable, more local businesses, nearby. Actually, there is an example. There's a model slow city that's here in suburban Maryland.
Tacoma Park?
It should be. We're slow. I agree. Tacoma Park is slow. But we came by it honest. We're old. We've been around since the 1800s. But there's a planned city that's farther out in Gaithersburg, and I forgot what it's called, but he tours it in this book. And it's supposedly, they built it to have a town center and everyone walks and what have you. But yeah, you're right. Tacoma Parks has it right. It's a great model where we walk from our house to the little coffee store a block away from our little offices here, where we have our podcast recording studio. And when Jesse needs to get new gear, the hardware store is connected to the same building, and he walks down there. And Tacoma Park, that's definitely slow living. All right, moving on. A novel, When the Lion Feeds by the late Wilbur Smith. Now, I say the late because he died in December. That's why I read this book. It's his very first book. I like first books, and so I figured, oh, here's a novelist I knew growing up in honor or motivated by his death. Let's go back and read his very first book. I have a couple points about it. I am a genre fiction fan, especially the adventure and techno thriller genres. As I grew up on those books, I'm a pseudo connoisseur of those two different genres of fiction writing. I really like them. They're not for everyone, but I really like them. Wilbur Smith was very influential in the rise of the sort of modern genre male-oriented adventure novel. So he sort of helped figure out the 20th century adventure novel that then influenced subsequent writers in that genre, like Clive Cussler, for example. So When the Lion Feeds is about, it follows a family. So it's part of a big trilogy, more than a trilogy. He wrote a whole series of books that followed a family generationally. So, this is the very first book. So it focuses on Sean Courtney, who starts the book as a kid, and he's middle-aged at the end of this book. And then I think the next book goes through his adult years. And in the third book, he's on the periphery. He's an old man, and they start following his kids. So, it's this intergenerational book series. It takes place in sort of British colonial Africa. Wilbur Smith wrote this book in the 1960s. It sort of follows this guy. He's on a farm, a cattle farm, and then tragedy befalls. They go to war, and long story short, he ends up having to leave the farm, and he starts over by wandering into this mountainous veld where they're just starting to discover gold. And a whole big portion of this book it's like economic adventure novel. Him and his partner just building up a gold mining fortune, like the nuts and bolts. We had to borrow money. We bought this land. We brought in this gear, and eventually that grows into Johannesburg, and then he loses all that fortune. And so, as one does, he travels into the bush to ivory hunt for a couple years. He says, I'll ivory hunt elephants for a couple years and use that to start my next fortune. And the book kind of ends after that. Good book. Trigger warning, right? This is written by a guy, a British colonial white guy in the 1960s who grew up in Africa. So it is not quite up to modern political sensibility. So trigger warning, you can kind of imagine it's not quite up to speed. If Edward Said read this book, his head would have exploded. And if you get that Edward Said reference, you should definitely not read this book because it's going to make you unhappy. All right, moving on. This one was a galley. So a publisher sent it to me. I don't think it's out as of this recording. It's coming out later in January 2022. It's a straight self-help book. So I'm also a sucker for the straight self-help category. I mean, me and the people I know, we write in this sort of New Yorker style self-help where you kind of cite science and Aristotle and you kind of gussy it up. Malcolm Gladwell invented this genre, but this is just straight self-help. I like straight self-help. It just gets right to it. Like, here's the 7 things, do this. Here's the worksheet. And this book was called Hero on a Mission. It was written by Donald Miller. I appreciated the grandiose ambition. Like, it's straight self-help on a really big thing. How do you make your life more meaningful? And I like people taking big swings at these type of topics. I think there's real value in, even if you can't obviously capture all of the complexity of cultivating a deep life in, one book, there is great value in trying to put some structure to it. I think it helps. The thing, I'll just say an aside, I really liked about Donald Miller is he talks about in the book that him and his wife bought 15 acres of land outside of Nashville. And it was scrub forest land with a lot of invasive species. And they're slowly like cultivating this land. They're selecting trees and getting rid of and replanting things. They have an orchard. They have a garden where they're planting pear trees to form they're working on them, shaping them to form a natural fence over the years. They're renovating the house and making it a place where they have events and retreats. And I don't know. I love that idea of having land with a name. I think this one's called Goose Hill. And spending a lot of time cultivating land. So I definitely got a lot of value out of that one. I don't know, Jesse, my wife will tell you, I always will have this dream of I should have land and just spend there and work with the trees. But also, I'm terrible at all that and have very little patience for it. So I think it would actually be disastrous if I really did have land. But for some reason, that's I don't know, it's my daydream. I'm not sure if you're a land guy.
Well, you're getting closer from buying the desk, so that's coming from the land for your new HQ at your house.
That's how I do it. Exactly right. So I have people who have land build me things off of the trees they have on their land. That's good. That's my connection.
It's a good first step.
Yeah. I have a very small yard at my house. Jesse has seen it. I do not. I have a very small yard, and I have a crew that takes care of it. So I should not have 15 acres of land. I think it would be somehow within 6 months, it would be on fire, would be part of it. There would be somehow an oil spill. I'm not quite sure how that would happen. So it would be on fire. It would be like covered in noxious chemicals and would become a home for like invasive, aggressive killer wasps that would start terrorizing the town. I think all of that would happen in about 6 months.
Well, somewhere there, hopefully you would have a writing shed so that wouldn't get burned down, so you could just escape to there. And
yeah, well, that is my dream. Is I want a writing shed, and I don't have room for a writing shed, it is a dream of mine. So I was having this and for real, I was having this conversation with two different people in the last month, writers who have a getaway plot. So it's kind of an interesting model. A place they go. It's not like a large cultivated land, and it's not nice. It's quiet, and they have a place to write. So I have a writer I was talking to who lives right outside New York City in a town that's kind of like Tacoma Park, and about 90 minutes up 87. He has some land. I guess that'd be like the Southern Catskills. There's a little writing shed, and then another guy, good friend of mine, was telling me he lives in Chicago, in the city, in a row house, and they just bought a plot that is 4 or 5 acres near one of the. I don't know what the Great Lake is near there, but whatever that is, Lake Michigan. It's not on the water. It's one lot in from the water, and it has like an old barn, and they're planting an orchard on it, and they can get there in 90 minutes as well. And he was showing me these plans, like a fireman forest fire watchtower, like they used to build to look for forest fires. And at the top of this tower, so it's like an elevated gazebo. And that's where he's going to do his deep work, because you can see the lake.
How does he get up there? Does he take an elevator, or is he?
It's going to be a ladder.
Ladder?
Yeah,
it's a little dangerous.
Up. Yeah.
It's like icy up there.
Well, a little bit of danger gets the heart going. So I'm excited about that. So I don't know. Maybe I like this notion of having a getaway plot that it's not super hard to maintain. You don't need like a really big house. But the key to a getaway plot is I think it has to be non-trivially sub 2 hours away. If it's 2 hours or more, you can't go and write for a day and come back.
Yeah, I see that. 2 quick points. There's no doubt in my mind that you'll find something like that. I've been listening to your stuff for a long time, and I think you'll find it eventually because you talk about it a lot. And then secondly, in terms of self-help books, I was listening to Ferris's podcast recently, and he quoted you on giving him the suggestion for the self-help book that he read when he wasn't even going to read new books. So that was kind of cool. I just listened to that recently.
Yeah, that's a good book. So it's Oliver Burkeman's book, 4,000 Weeks. I talked about it. I told Tim about it, and then Tim read it, and then Tim did the thing that I think every publisher wishes would happen. Which is Tim, I believe you listen to this. He released the first chapter, like the audio book version of the first chapter of Oliver's book, on his podcast. Is that right?
Yeah. I just listened to it actually.
Man, could you imagine having like the first chapter of your audio book on Ferris's podcast? But 4,000 Weeks is a cool book. I read it a long time ago because I blurbed it. So I read it, back before it came out. And it's a great concept. It's called Time Management for Mortals. And 4,000 weeks is roughly how many weeks you live. And Oliver's whole point is most things you're not going to get done. You have a very limited amount of time. All these wild dreams you have, most of them won't happen. And be okay with that. And spend more time enjoying what you do have and what you can do, and don't be so aggressively goal oriented. It was that book hit a nerve well before Ferris mentioned it. That thing was that thing crushed it. I think it's one of the better selling in our world of like the people we know that write the sort of New Yorker style self-help. He's a Guardian guy, a very smart guy. I think that book is the one that really crushed it this year. It was very happy for Oliver. I've always loved his stuff, and he's been very kind to my stuff. So circle goes around. All right, one more book. I finally read some Wendell Berry. So I don't know. Do you know any? He's not as well known as I thought. Have you heard of Wendell Berry?
No.
Cool guy. He's old now. He's in his 80s. But he grew up in Kentucky on a small farm. Went to New York City. Got educated, I don't know, Columbia or NYU or something. Got sort of overly educated. Got a writing job in New York City. He wanted to be a writer, and he was going to do the whole modern cosmopolitan writer thing where you live in a city. You're not from somewhere. You're just observing things around the world, And for whatever reason, he's like, I don't like this. I'm from Kentucky. I want to go back to Kentucky. I want Kentucky to be my muse. That's like, I want to be from a place and write about the place. I don't want to be just this abstraction writer that just is commenting on the world from a cosmopolitan detached place. It's like, I want to go back. So he moves back to Kentucky, gets a professorship at a small Kentucky college near where he grew up. Him and his wife buy, I think it's 12 acres, like a hobby farm. He grew up farming, but this is not a production farm. And he's like, we're going to live on 12 acres. I'm going to be a professor, and I'm going to write about Kentucky. And then like another plot became available. We should probably buy that. And then like another plot became available after that. We should probably buy that. And he ends up with like a real production farm, 100+ acre farm. And this is why he's awesome. It's like, I'm not into this whole gasoline thing. I'm going to farm the way I learned to farm, which is teams of horses. And he doesn't farm. He's 80 now, but all throughout his career, he never went to tractors. He farmed with horses. This guy's awesome. So he leaves New York to farm with horses, this farm in Kentucky, rural Kentucky, and is a novelist, poet, but mainly an essayist. And he writes essays. He presages Bill McKibben, like very Bill McKibben style essays about the economy and the environment, and a very influential writer. And writes it from this farm where he doesn't own a computer, and you can't read. If you want to talk to him, you have to call the farmhouse and come out to the farm. He's like, awesome guy. And they just released the first sort of definitive essay collection where they pulled together. It's called The World Ending Fire. This came out in 2019. If you get the audio version, I think Nick Offerman, who I also love from Parks and Recreation, Ron Swanson, who by the way is a guy who lives in LA as a working actor, but also has a giant woodworking wood shop in a light industrial warehouse in LA. And like, he spends a lot of time building canoes. He like Ron Swanson, he does the intro or the prologue. So on the audiobook, Nick Offerman reads it. Anyways, so I read my first full collection of Wendell Berry essays.
Are you going to take a field trip out there and check it out?
I should, man. This guy's awesome. He has an essay in there that I might write a essay about for my newsletter that's called Why I Didn't Buy a Computer, which is cool. And I think this was the 80s when he wrote this essay. And he's like, look, here's my rules for technology. And it's very much like I wrote about in Deep Work, where I go and I talk to a farmer, Forrest Pritchard, and say, like, farmers have like pretty strict criteria for when they're going to spend money on a new tool. Otherwise they'll go bankrupt. And we should have that same strict criteria when thinking about technology. We shouldn't just say, I don't know, I heard about TikTok, I should probably use it. Like, we should have a farmer's mindset. That was my point in Deep Work. It'd be like, what's the value? What's the cost? Is there better ways to get that value? Wendell Berry wrote this essay about this in the 80s. I didn't know about this, where he gave his whole list of like, here's how I decide whether or not to use a new technology, and the computer doesn't pass that test. And he published it in Harper's. But what's cool about it is he got in trouble, and they published the whole thing is in the essay collection. So he wrote this essay. He's like, I don't need a computer. And see if you can see the part here. We got in trouble. He's like, yeah, I write my things longhand, and my wife types them up, and we're good. So that got him in a lot of trouble. And in the essay collection, they published the article, like the Harper's published a lot of these letters, and they published the letters in the essay collection. So then a lot of people got mad about that, and they say, oh, well, you have a great technology called wife, and that's how you actually blah, blah, blah. So then he wrote an essay in response, right? This is like analog Twitter.
Yeah.
Like Twitter, but if like Twitter was in Harper's Magazine and there was like a week between every, so he writes this thing in response, and he's like, basically, screw you. You don't know our family. You don't know what's like how our marriage works or this or that, and goes on this whole big, long, whatever. And he's like, why are you all so defensive? I must have touched a nerve, like saying I don't need a computer, and you're all so mad at me. Like you're all techno-determinist, apologist. Like it's really interesting, like this heated back and forth. And then this was kind of interesting. He introduces this very grounded in farming idea of home economics, which is quite different than sort of what you would see in suburban DC, where, it's all salary job, dual income government families. He's like, we have a home economy. It's a very farmer way of thinking about it. And that everyone in the family, me and my wife, we're all part of. We have this farm we run, and there's all these different things that have to happen, and this fence has to get repaired, and the milking has to happen, and the horses have to be fed. I mean, I don't know how it works. And we're all just working on everything as part of keeping this, like, Berry Incorporated, this household economy functioning, which is a very sort of when you're not thinking about salaried work, but like I'm producing from land, it's the way you think. It's like we have endless things that have to happen that we're all working on and trying to keep collectively our farm running. He thought of his article writing, he just placed it in that same context. He's like, yeah, like these articles that go out is sort of part of what keeps the household economy running. We're all just part of it. I do some writing, she does some editing, we do some whatever. Like, it's just like I put the staves on the fence and you whitewash them. And so it was really interesting to see this clash that was happening. It's like a culture clash, is that he was coming from a world where you like owned land and that was your source of income. It was very, you're a, I don't know what the right term is, but like yeoman farmer type thing. Like, I'm trying to make a living off of, our family's trying to make a living off of our land, and we all work together to try to do it. He was coming from that mindset, but in the 80s, everything was shifting towards, like, most people weren't on farms. Most people weren't running their own small businesses in town, where just the whole family works at it, the donut shop to keep it running. It was salaries, and it was typically dual income salaries. And so this whole discussion about work and meaning and who's working and not working, like all of that was just beginning. And this Why Don't Buy a Computer came out, boom, right as that was happening. And you get to see in that frisson, like, this is when this huge cultural shift was happening. So anyways, that was a cool part of the book, is in this essays and the letters and the back and forth, you can see like these worlds colliding. And in the collision, you actually got more insight than what any individual essay or letter was saying about that. It was like this very dialectical thing. It was really cool. It's like in the collision of Berry with these letter writers in the 80s, you got more insight into the changing culture than you got from just reading any one individual essay about that period. So I just wanted to point that out as a pretty cool part of the book.
You should send him a letter, because earlier you were talking about how your friend saw the mention on Twitter, but this way you only have be able to get in touch with him if you send him a letter.
That's literally how you get in touch with them, by the way.
No, I know.
That's how
you should do it.
That's how reporters do it. I mean, that's how this essay book came together. You have to send them a letter, and then like he may answer. He's very old now.
Probably doesn't get much mail.
Yeah, I wonder what that's like. If you only do letters,
probably like getting mail.
But it's the internet age. Does he get like a lot of? I'm sure he gets a lot of, stuff from publicists, like books. Will you blurb this, like that type of stuff? But, anyways, Barry's a cool guy. I'm gonna read some more Barry. All right. So, anyways, that's what I read in December 2021. I'm deep into working on January 2022 books, and we will check in at the end of this month with how my current reading is going.